Sometimes the hardest roads in life lead us to the greatest blessings. Clayton Briggs never imagined his broken life could be mended by something as small as one starving pup. At nearly 60, the widowed cowboy has nothing left but old regrets and a bottle to numb them. He fixes broken wagons in a dying prairie town, alone with his ghosts. Then one dusty evening, a gaunt little dog limps up his road, carrying a weathered bag in its jaws. Inside is a faded photograph, a woman holding a baby, and Clayton's name written on the back. His daughter. His grandson he never knew existed. The pup came from miles away, leading him to family he thought he'd lost forever. But what will Clayton find when he follows that loyal dog home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the eastern hills when Clayton Briggs emerged from the boarding house, squinting against the morning light. His joints protested the movement, a familiar complaint these days. At 58, he carried his years like stones in his pockets, heavy and impossible to set down. Hollowbrook wasn't much of a town anymore. What had once been a thriving stop along the cattle routes now stood half abandoned, its buildings weathered grey by wind and neglect. The general store still opened most days, and the saloon kept its doors unlocked for the handful of men who had nowhere better to spend their evenings. But the hotel had closed 5 years back, and the church bell hadn't rung in longer than that. Clayton's workshop sat at the edge of town, a lean-to structure with a roof that leaked when it rained. Inside, his tools hung on the wall in careful order. Hammers and awls, planes and chisels, each one worn smooth by decades of use. These tools had been his father's once, passed down with the promise that a man who could work with his hands would never go hungry. Clayton had believed that once. Now he knew better. He ran his fingers along the handle of an old chisel, feeling the grooves where his father's hands had gripped it, then his own. The wood was dark with oil and sweat, burnished by time into something almost beautiful. These tools were the only things of value he still owned, and some nights when the whiskey ran low, he considered selling them. But he never did. They were all he had left of the man his father had been. The man Clayton had tried to be. A wagon waited in the yard, its axle split clean through. Mrs. Peterson had brought it in 3 days ago, her face tight with worry. She needed it fixed by week's end to haul her winter supplies from the rail depot in Crenshaw, 20 miles north. Clayton had quoted her $2 for the work. She'd countered with $1.50 and a jar of preserves. He'd taken the deal. That was how things worked in Hollowbrook now, barter and hope. Favors called in, debts that might never be repaid. He knelt beside the wagon, his knees cracking loud enough to startle a crow from the nearby fence post. The brake was clean at least. He could splice in a new length of ash, reinforce it with iron strapping. It would hold. His work always held, even when everything else in his life had come apart. The morning passed in the rhythm of labor, the rasp of the plane, the ring of hammer on metal, the smell of fresh-cut wood mingling with dust and old grease. Clayton lost himself in it the way he always did. When his hands were busy, his mind had less room for the thoughts that circled like vultures at sunset. By noon, the heat had climbed to something fierce. Clayton straightened, pressing one hand to the small of his back, and walked to the rain barrel for a drink. The water was tepid and tasted of rust, but it cut the dust in his throat. He was wiping his mouth when he heard footsteps behind him. "You planning to finish that wagon today, or are you going to make the widow wait till Sunday?" Clayton turned to find Doc Henley standing in the shade of the workshop, a wry smile on his weathered face. The doctor was older than Clayton by a decade, but he stood straighter and moved with more purpose. He still made his rounds to the outlying homesteads, still set bones and delivered babies when called upon. He was the closest thing to a friend Clayton had left. "It'll be done when it's done," Clayton said. "Mrs. Peterson knows that. What she knows," Doc said, stepping into the light, "is that you'll do good work for half what it's worth, and she's grateful for it." "Doesn't mean she won't worry," Clayton grunted and turned back to the wagon. Doc had a way of saying things that made a man feel both better and worse at the same time. It was probably what made him good at his job. You eaten today? Doc asked. Had coffee. That's not food, Clayton. It's enough. Doc sighed, the sound of a man who'd had this conversation before and knew he'd have it again. Widow Hartman's got a pot of stew on. She sent me to fetch you. Says you're looking too thin. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're stubborn. There's a difference. Doc moved closer, his voice dropping. When's the last time you had a proper meal? One that didn't come from a tin or a bottle? Clayton didn't answer. He picked up his hammer and examined the iron strapping, turning it over in his hands as though it required his full attention. Margaret wouldn't want this for you, Doc said quietly. The name hit Clayton like a fist to the chest. He set down the hammer with more force than necessary. Don't, he said. Someone has to say it. No one has to say anything. Clayton's voice had gone flat, hard. What Margaret wanted doesn't matter anymore. She's been gone 8 years, and you've been punishing yourself for it every day since. Clayton turned to face him then, his jaw tight. I'm not punishing myself. I'm just living. That's not living, Clayton. That's waiting to die. The words hung between them, sharp and true. For a long moment, neither man spoke. A hot wind moved through the yard, stirring up dust devils that danced and collapsed. Finally, Doc shook his head. Come eat or don't, but the offer stands. Widow Hartman's place, whenever you're ready. He started to leave, then paused. And Clayton? That daughter of yours? I don't have a daughter. Doc's expression softened with something that might have been pity. You do. You just haven't spoken to her in 20 years. That's not the same as not having one. He walked away before Clayton could respond, his boots crunching on the dry ground. Clayton watched him go, feeling the familiar ache settle in his chest, the one that had nothing to do with age or hard work and everything to do with choices, made and words spoken that couldn't be taken back. Sarah. He hadn't let himself think her name in so long, that it felt foreign in his mind, like a word from another language. But Doc was right. She was still his daughter, no matter how many years had passed, no matter how deep the silence between them had grown. It had been a fight about love, of all things. Sarah had been 18, bright-eyed and full of dreams, and she'd fallen for a drifter named Tom Holloway, a man with charm and empty pockets and no prospects to speak of. Clayton had forbidden the match. He'd raised his voice, called Tom a fool, and worse. He'd told Sarah she was throwing her life away, that she'd regret it before a year was out. She'd married Tom anyway, in a ceremony Clayton hadn't attended. Margaret had gone, weeping through her smiles, and she'd come home with news of a small wedding in a church 2 towns over. Sarah had worn Margaret's mother's dress, altered to fit. She'd asked for her father, Margaret said. She'd looked for him right up until the moment she said her vows, but Clayton hadn't gone. Pride had kept him away. Pride and the stubborn certainty that he was right, that Sarah would see the mistake she was making and come home asking for forgiveness. She never did. Margaret had tried to mend things. She'd written letters to Sarah, travelled once to visit. But Clayton had refused to bend. And then Margaret had taken ill, a fever that wouldn't break, a cough that wouldn't clear. She'd wasted away over 6 terrible months, and in her final days she'd begged Clayton to make peace with their daughter. Write to her, Margaret had whispered, her voice thin as paper. Tell her you're sorry. Tell her you love her. Clayton had promised he would. He'd held Margaret's hand and sworn it. But after she died, after the funeral and the terrible silence that followed, he'd never put pen to paper. The grief had been too large, the regret too sharp. And beneath it all, the pride remained, smaller now, meaner, but still strong enough to keep him from reaching out. 20 years. 20 years of silence. Clayton picked up his tools and returned to work. The axle wouldn't fix itself, and the day was burning away. He worked through the afternoon, through the slant of golden light that painted the workshop walls, through the first cool breath of evening. When he finally stepped back to examine his work, the shadows had grown long, and the crickets had started their evening song. The axle was solid. The wagon would hold. Mrs. Peterson would have her supplies for winter. Clayton cleaned his tools with careful attention, wiping each one before hanging it in its proper place. This ritual mattered. In a life where so much had broken and scattered, this small act of order felt essential. When the last tool was hung, he locked the workshop door and started the walk back to town. Widow Hartman's boarding house stood on Main Street, a two-story structure with a sagging porch and windows that glowed warm against the gathering dusk. The widow herself was on the porch, sweeping dust that would return before morning. She looked up as Clayton approached, her face creasing into a smile. "There you are," she said. "I saved you a plate. You didn't have to do that. I know I didn't, but I did anyway. It's on the stove, keeping warm. Help yourself." Clayton nodded his thanks and climbed the steps. The boarding house smelled of wood smoke and cooked onions, of lye soap and old wood. His room was on the second floor, a small space with a narrow bed, a chair and a washstand. He'd lived there since Margaret died, unable to stay in the house they'd shared, unable to bear the weight of her absence in every room. He ate the stew standing at the stove, too hungry to bother with sitting down. It was good, thick with vegetables and chunks of beef, seasoned with herbs from the widow's garden. When he finished, he washed the bowl and left it to dry, then climbed the stairs to his room. The photograph of Margaret sat on the washstand, her face forever young, forever smiling. Clayton looked at it every night, this ritual as essential as cleaning his tools. She'd been beautiful, his Margaret, kind and patient and stronger than he'd ever given her credit for. She deserved better than the bitter, broken man he'd become in her absence. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her image, the same words he spoke every night. "I'm so sorry," but sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't bring her back or mend the rift with Sarah or make the years disappear. Sorry was just a word he spoke into the darkness, hoping somehow it might be enough. Clayton undressed and lay down on the narrow bed. Through the window, he could see the stars emerging one by one, bright and distant and indifferent. Sleep would come eventually, and with it the dreams, some good, most not. And in the morning he would wake and do it all again. Fix another wagon, earn another dollar, drink away another evening. This was his life now. This was all it would ever be. The thought should have brought despair, but Clayton had moved beyond that. Despair required hope first, and he'd run out of that years ago. What he felt now was simpler, duller, a kind of resigned acceptance that this was his lot, the harvest he'd earned from the seeds he'd planted. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked once and fell silent. The wind moved through the eaves, carrying the smell of dust and sage. Clayton closed his eyes and waited for sleep to find him. Alone in the dark, alone with his regrets, alone in every way that mattered. The next evening arrived the way evenings always did in Hollowbrook, slow and dusty, the heat lingering even as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Clayton had finished Mrs. Peterson's wagon and collected his $1.50, which he'd promptly traded for a bottle at the saloon. Now he walked back toward the boarding house, the whiskey warm against his ribs, his shadow stretching long behind him. He was tired, bone-tired in a way that sleep never seemed to fix. His hands ached from the day's work, and his knee, the one he'd twisted in a fall from a horse 15 years back, throbbed with each step. Getting old was nobody's friend, but it was particularly unkind to men who'd spent their lives working with their backs and hands. The road was empty, as it usually was this time of day. Most folks were inside eating supper or settling in for the evening. Clayton preferred it this way. The solitude suited him. He'd grown accustomed to his own company, to the silence that filled his days. It was easier than conversation, easier than pretending things were fine when they weren't. He was nearly to the boarding house when he heard it. A soft, whimpering sound, barely louder than the wind. He stopped, listening. There it was again, coming from somewhere ahead. Clayton rounded the corner and saw the dog. It was a small thing, some kind of terrier mix with matted brown fur and ribs showing through its sides. It sat in the middle of the road, trembling, something clutched in its jaws. When it saw Clayton, it didn't run. Instead, it watched him with dark, desperate eyes. "Get on," Clayton said, waving his hand. "Go on home." The dog didn't move. Clayton took a step forward, and the dog stood but didn't retreat. It just watched him, waiting. That's when Clayton noticed what it was carrying, a small canvas bag, weathered and stained, tied shut with a piece of twine. "What have you got there?" Clayton asked. Though he had no expectation of an answer, the dog took 2 steps toward him, then stopped. It set the bag on the ground carefully, then backed away, watching. Clayton felt a strange unease creep up his spine. There was something deliberate in the animal's behavior, something almost human in the way it had approached and presented its burden. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching, but the street remained empty. "Whose dog are you?" he said quietly. The dog whined again, a sound full of pleading. Against his better judgment, Clayton approached. His knee protested as he knelt down, and he grunted with the effort. The bag lay in the dust, unremarkable save for the fact that a starving dog had carried it here and refused to leave it. Clayton picked it up. The canvas was soft with age and wear, the twine knotted tight. He worked at the knot with stiff fingers until it came free, then opened the bag. Inside was a photograph. Clayton lifted it out, his hand suddenly unsteady. The image was faded, the edges curled with time, but he could see it clearly enough. A young woman with dark hair and his own eyes, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. The woman was smiling, though the smile looked tired. The baby's face was scrunched up, one tiny fist visible above the blanket's edge. Clayton turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he didn't recognize, were 3 words. For Clayton Briggs. Below that, in different ink, someone had written, "Your grandson, James, 6 months old." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Clayton sat down hard in the dust, the photograph trembling in his hands. Sarah. That was Sarah holding a baby. His grandson. He had a grandson. The realization crashed over him in waves. 6 months old, the note said. Which meant, how long ago had this picture been taken? The photograph looked old, but that could have been the conditions it was stored in, the journey it had made. How old was the boy now? A year? 2 years? Older? Clayton's chest felt tight. He couldn't get enough air. All these years he'd told himself that Sarah had gone on to live her life without him, that she'd built a family and been happy and never looked back. He'd used that story to justify his silence, to excuse his pride. But here was proof that she'd thought of him. She'd taken a picture of her son and written his name on the back. She'd meant for him to see it, and he'd never known. The dog whined again, closer now. Clayton looked up to find it standing just a few feet away, watching him with those same desperate eyes. The animal was starving. He could see that clearly now in the fading light. Its fur was dull and matted, its body thin to the point of collapse. It had traveled far carrying this bag. It had come looking for him specifically. "Where did you come from?" Clayton asked, his voice rough. The dog took a step forward, then another. It moved to Clayton's side and sat down, leaning its weight against his leg. The gesture was so trusting, so deliberate, that Clayton felt something crack inside his chest. He reached out slowly and touched the dog's head. The fur was coarse and dirty, but the dog leaned into his hand, accepting the touch with a small sound of relief. How long had it been since this animal had known kindness? How far had it traveled, and what had driven it to make such a journey? Clayton looked at the photograph again, studying Sarah's face. She looked older than he remembered, worn down by something he couldn't name. The smile didn't reach her eyes, and the baby, James, his grandson, he looked like Sarah had at that age. The same nose, the same serious expression even in sleep. "Is she—" Clayton couldn't finish the question. "Is she alive? Is she well? Is she looking for me?" The dog stood abruptly and walked a few paces back the way it had come. It stopped and looked over its shoulder at Clayton, waiting. "You want me to follow you?" Clayton said. It wasn't a question. The dog barked once, sharp and insistent. Clayton struggled to his feet, his knee screaming in protest. The photograph was still in his hand, and he tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The bag he left in the dust. It was empty now, its purpose served. The dog started walking, slow enough that Clayton could keep pace. It moved with purpose, despite its exhaustion, despite the fact that it could barely stand. Every few steps, it would look back to make sure Clayton was following. They walked. Through town, past the boarding house and the saloon, past the general store with its darkened windows. No one was out to see them, a broken old man following a starving dog into the dusk. At the edge of town, where the road split toward the open prairie, the dog stopped. It turned to look at Clayton one more time, and in that moment, he understood. This wasn't the end of the journey. This was just the beginning. The dog had brought him the photograph, had delivered its message, but the real destination lay somewhere out there, beyond the edge of town, across miles of open country he hadn't traveled in years. Sarah was out there, his grandson was out there, and they needed him. Clayton looked down at the dog, at its trembling legs and desperate eyes. "Can you make it back?" he asked. The dog whined, a sound that said it would try, it would keep going. As long as it needed to, as long as there was purpose in the going. "All right," Clayton said softly. "All right, we'll go together." The dog's tail moved, not quite a wag, but close. It started walking again, and Clayton followed, his hand resting on the photograph in his pocket, his heart beating hard against his ribs. Behind them, Hollowbrook faded into the gathering darkness. Ahead, the prairie stretched out endless and unknown. Clayton didn't know what he would find at the end of this road. He didn't know if Sarah would want to see him, or if he'd even recognize the daughter he'd turned away all those years ago. But he was going to find out. That starving dog had traveled miles to bring him a message, and Clayton Briggs, stubborn, broken, full of regrets, was finally going to answer it. Clayton stopped at the edge of the prairie and looked back at Hollowbrook one last time. The town's few lights flickered in the distance, small and fragile, against the vast darkness. Everything he'd known for the past 8 years was back there. His workshop, his tools, his narrow room at the boarding house. Leaving felt like stepping off a cliff. But the dog was already moving forward, and Clayton couldn't turn back now. He needed supplies, that much was clear. The prairie wasn't forgiving, especially not to a man his age traveling on foot. He had the bottle in his pocket and the photograph, but little else. No food, no water, no bedroll. He'd been so caught up in the moment, in the desperate need to follow this animal, that he hadn't stopped to think practically. The dog seemed to sense his hesitation. It stopped and looked back, waiting. "I need to get some things," Clayton said. "Just wait here." He walked back toward town, moving as quickly as his aching knee would allow. The boarding house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in the window, Widow Hartman's reading light. She'd be up for another hour at least, working on her needlework or reading from her worn Bible. Clayton slipped in through the front door, grateful it didn't creak. He climbed the stairs to his room and lit the lamp, keeping the flame low. His possessions were few and quickly gathered. A change of clothes, a tin cup, a knife that had been his father's. He pulled his canvas coat from the peg, the one he wore on cold mornings. On the washstand, Margaret's photograph watched him. For a moment, Clayton considered leaving it behind, but his hand moved of its own accord, tucking the frame carefully into his coat pocket. He couldn't leave her, not when he was finally doing something she'd wanted, something that might have made her proud. From beneath the bed, he pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was what was left of his savings, $3.40. It wasn't much, but it might buy food along the way, or help if he ran into trouble. He pocketed the money and closed the box. The last thing he took was his father's compass. It sat in the drawer of the washstand, brass tarnished with age but still functional. His father had carried it through the war, had used it to guide them west when Clayton was just a boy. It had been passed to Clayton on his father's deathbed, along with the tools and the advice about honest work. Clayton held the compass in his palm, feeling its weight. The face was scratched, the glass cracked in one corner, but the needle still found north. It was a tool for finding your way when you were lost. He'd needed it more times in his life than he cared to count. He slipped the compass into his pocket and took one last look around the room. 8 years he'd lived here, and in that time he'd accumulated almost nothing of value. It should have been sad, but instead, Clayton felt something like relief. There was freedom in having so little to lose. He left a note for Widow Hartman on the washstand. "Gone to find my daughter. Thank you for your kindness." He didn't know when he'd be back, or if he'd be back at all. But she deserved to know he hadn't just vanished. Clayton descended the stairs as quietly as he could and slipped out into the night. The dog was waiting where he'd left it, patient despite its exhaustion. When it saw Clayton, it stood and started walking again. They moved through the darkness, the dog setting a steady pace that Clayton struggled to match. His knee throbbed with each step, and his breath came harder than it should have. He was too old for this kind of journey, too broken. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, following the small shape ahead of him. The prairie opened up around them, vast and empty under a sky brilliant with stars. There was no moon yet, just starlight and the faint glow of the Milky Way stretching overhead. Clayton had forgotten how big the night could be out here, away from town. How small it made a man feel. They walked for what felt like hours. Clayton's legs burned, and his knee sent sharp pains up his thigh with each step. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cooling air. He wanted to stop, to rest, but the dog kept moving, and he couldn't bring himself to call it back. Finally, the dog slowed and stopped near a small stand of cottonwood trees. A thin creek ran through the grove, barely more than a trickle, but enough to make a soft sound in the darkness. The dog walked to the water's edge and drank deeply. Clayton lowered himself to the ground with a groan and pulled off his boot. His knee had swollen, hot to the touch even through his pant leg. He needed to rest it, elevate it if possible. At this rate, he wouldn't make it more than a few miles before the joint gave out entirely. He drank from the creek, cupping his hands and bringing the water to his mouth. It was cold and tasted of minerals and earth. When he'd drunk his fill, he splashed water on his face and neck, washing away the dust and sweat. The dog had collapsed in the grass, its sides heaving. Clayton studied the animal in the starlight. It was in terrible shape, dehydrated, starving, pushed far beyond what any creature should endure. Yet it had made this journey, had found him somehow in a town it couldn't have known, had delivered its message, and now was guiding him back. Why? Clayton asked aloud. "Why did you come all that way? Who sent you?" The dog lifted its head, watching him with those dark eyes. It didn't have answers, of course. It was just an animal doing what it had been trained or compelled to do. But there was intelligence there, purpose. Someone had sent this dog. Someone who knew Clayton's name, who knew where to find him. Sarah. It had to be Sarah. Clayton pulled the photograph from his pocket and looked at it again, though he could barely make out the details in the darkness. His daughter's face, his grandson's tiny form. He'd missed so much. Years he could never get back, moments he'd never witness. First steps, first words, first smiles, all of it gone while he'd sat in his workshop, nursing his pride and his grief, the weight of it pressed down on him, heavy as stones. He'd been such a fool, such a stubborn, prideful fool. And now what? What did he think would happen when he finally found Sarah? That she'd welcome him with open arms? That she'd forgive 20 years of silence and abandonment? He didn't know. He couldn't let himself hope for that. But he had to try. The dog had come all this way. The least he could do was see the journey through. Clayton stretched out on the grass, using his bundled coat as a pillow. His knee throbbed and his muscles ached, but exhaustion pulled at him like a riptide. The dog crept closer, curling up against his side for warmth. Its small body trembled with weariness. "We'll rest a bit," Clayton murmured. "Then we'll keep going." The dog's breathing slowed and deepened. Clayton closed his eyes and listened to the night, the creek's soft murmur, the rustle of cottonwood leaves, the distant cry of an owl hunting across the prairie. These were the sounds of his youth, of a time before loss had carved him hollow. They felt both familiar and strange, like a language he'd once spoken but had almost forgotten. Sleep came in fits, broken by pain and anxiety. But when the first grey light of dawn crept across the sky, Clayton opened his eyes and sat up. The dog was already awake, watching him, waiting. "All right," Clayton said, his voice rough with sleep and old sorrows. "Let's find them." They traveled through the morning as the sun climbed and the day grew warm. Clayton's knee had stiffened overnight, and each step felt like walking on broken glass. But he pushed forward, following the dog across terrain that grew increasingly rough and unfamiliar. The prairie here was different from the land around Hollowbrook. Rockier with more gullies and rises. Mesquite and prickly pear dotted the landscape, and twice they startled jackrabbits that bounded away in long, panicked leaps. The dog paid them no mind, focused entirely on the path ahead. Around midday, they crested a low hill, and Clayton saw smoke rising in the distance. A thin column that suggested a campfire or cook stove. The dog hesitated, looking back at Clayton as if asking permission. "Might be someone can spare some water," Clayton said. "And maybe some food for you." They approached cautiously. As they drew closer, Clayton could make out a small homestead. A cabin with a sod roof, a corral with 2 horses, a vegetable garden ringed by rocks. A woman stood outside, stirring something in a large pot over an open fire. She looked up as they approached, shading her eyes against the sun. "Help you?" she called out, her tone wary. Clayton raised his hand in greeting. "Yes, ma'am. Just passing through. Wondered if you might spare some water, and maybe something for the dog here." The woman studied them for a long moment, taking in Clayton's limping gait and the dog's emaciated frame. Her expression softened. "You look like you've come a fair distance." "Both of you?" "We have." "Well, come on then. I've got stew on, and there's a pump by the house." Clayton approached slowly, grateful beyond words. The woman was somewhere in her 40s, with sun-weathered skin and capable hands. She wore a simple dress and an apron, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Name's Ruth Carmody," she said. "This is my husband's place, but he's off in Blackwater buying seed. Won't be back till tomorrow." "Clayton Briggs, I appreciate your hospitality." Ruth ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to Clayton, then filled a second bowl and set it on the ground for the dog. The animal fell on the food with desperate hunger, eating so fast Clayton worried it might choke. "Poor thing's been starved," Ruth said, watching the dog. "Where'd you find it?" "It found me, actually. Came into Hollowbrook 3 days back carrying a message." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "That's some distance." "Hollowbrook's 30 miles east, near as I reckon. Is it?" Clayton hadn't realized they'd come so far. His sense of direction had never been his strongest suit. What kind of message? Ruth asked. Clayton hesitated, then pulled the photograph from his pocket. It's my daughter and my grandson. I haven't seen her in 20 years. The dog's leading me to her, I think." Ruth took the photograph carefully, studying it in the sunlight. Her expression grew thoughtful. "Your daughter live out this way?" "I don't know where she lives." "That's what I'm trying to find out. And you're following a dog on faith?" "I am." Ruth handed back the photograph. "That's either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Briggs." "Probably both," Clayton admitted. He ate the stew slowly, savoring each bite. It was good, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of venison. The first real meal he'd had in days. "Do you know many homesteads out this way?" "A few. Mostly people keep to themselves. There's the Morrison place about 10 miles west, and the Hendersons south of here. Past that it's pretty empty, till you get to Red Creek Valley. That's where most of the scattered homesteaders are. Folks trying to make a go of it on hard land, Red Creek Valley." The name meant nothing to Clayton, but he filed it away. If Sarah was homesteading, that might be where she'd ended up. "How far is Red Creek Valley?" he asked. "Another day's walk, maybe 2 if you're moving slow. The dog seems to know where it's going, so I'd trust that." Clayton finished the stew and thanked her. Ruth refilled the dog's bowl, and this time the animal ate more slowly, its immediate hunger blunted. She also brought out a piece of jerky and some hardtack, wrapping them in cloth. "For the road," she said. "You look like you could use it. I can pay you, no need. I remember what it's like to be separated from family. My sister lives in Kansas. Haven't seen her in 7 years. If she sent me a message and I had to walk across 2 states to get to her, I'd hope someone along the way would show me kindness." Clayton accepted the food with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am, truly," Ruth smiled. "You take care of that knee. It's swollen bad. When you get where you're going, put cold water on it and keep it elevated." "I will." They left the homestead with full stomachs and renewed strength. The dog seemed lighter on its feet, its tail up instead of dragging. Clayton felt better too, though his knee still throbbed with each step. The food and brief rest had done them both good. As they walked, Clayton's mind drifted back through the years. He thought about Sarah as a little girl, no more than 5 or 6, following him around the workshop while he worked. She'd been curious about everything, always asking questions. "Why do you use that tool, Papa? What makes the wood smooth? Can I try?" He'd been patient with her then. He'd shown her how to hold a hammer, how to measure twice and cut once, how to read the grain of wood to know which way it would split. She'd been a quick learner, eager to please him. Her small hands had worked beside his own, and he'd been proud of her. Where had that man gone? The father who'd taken time to teach his daughter, who'd smiled at her questions and praised her efforts. When had he become the bitter man who'd driven her away? Margaret had tried to warn him. "You're too hard on her," she'd said more than once. "She's young. She'll make mistakes." But Clayton had been convinced he knew better. He'd wanted to protect Sarah from hardship, from bad decisions. He'd thought refusing to bless her marriage to Tom was the right thing to do. He'd been wrong. So terribly wrong. And by the time he'd understood that, Margaret was dying and Sarah was long gone. Clayton reached into his pocket and touched the photograph. His grandson, James, would be older now than he'd been in that picture. Old enough to walk and talk, maybe. Old enough to have questions about the world, the way Sarah once had. Would Clayton ever get the chance to answer those questions? Or had he forfeited that right 20 years ago? The sun was sliding toward the western horizon when they stopped for the night beside a dry wash. There was no water here, but Clayton still had some in his canteen from Ruth Carmody's pump. He shared it with the dog, then ate some of the jerky and hardtack she'd given him. The dog curled up close, and Clayton stroked its head gently. The animal's breathing had steadied, and its trembling had stopped. Given food and rest, it was recovering its strength. There was resilience in creatures, both human and animal. The capacity to endure, to keep moving forward even when everything seemed lost. Clayton hoped he had some of that resilience left in him. He was going to need it. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, Clayton lay back and looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there, beyond these miles of prairie, Sarah was living a life he knew nothing about. She'd had a child, raised him, was raising him, without her father's help or presence. She'd managed on her own, the way he'd forced her to. "I'm coming," Clayton whispered to the night. "I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm coming." The dog stirred beside him, as if acknowledging his words. Together, they rested beneath the stars, 2 weary travelers on a road that might lead to forgiveness or might lead to nothing at all. Red Creek Valley revealed itself gradually as they crested the final rise. Below, a shallow valley stretched out, greener than the surrounding prairie thanks to the creek that wound through its center. Clayton counted maybe a dozen homesteads scattered across the landscape, each marked by a small cabin or sod house. Thin columns of smoke rising from chimneys. The dog's pace had quickened as they'd drawn closer. Now it moved with purpose, no longer just guiding but leading with clear intent. Its ears were up, its tail wagging slightly. This was familiar territory. They descended into the valley as the afternoon sun began its slow descent. A few cattle grazed near the creek, and Clayton could see fields that had been planted with wheat or corn, though the crops looked sparse and struggling. This was hard land, the kind that fought you for every bushel. The first person they encountered was an older man working on a fence line near the road. He looked up as Clayton and the dog approached, squinting against the sun. Recognition flashed across his face when he saw the animal. "Well, I'll be," the man said. "That's the Holloway dog. Thought it had run off for good." Clayton stopped, his heart suddenly pounding. "Holloway? You know the family?" "Sure do. They're up the valley about 2 miles. Got a place on the north side near the cottonwoods." The man's expression turned curious. "You a friend of theirs?" Clayton hesitated. "I'm Sarah's father." "Clayton Briggs." The man's eyebrows rose. "Her father?" She never mentioned. He caught himself, seeming to realize he'd said too much. "Well, I expect she'll be glad to see you." There was something in his tone that suggested otherwise, but Clayton didn't press. "How are they doing?" "Sarah and her family." The man's face grew somber. "Not so good, truth be told." Tom Holloway passed on near 3 months ago. Took sick sudden like. Left Sarah alone with the boy, and a homestead that's barely making ends meet. Clayton felt the ground shift beneath him. Tom was dead. The man he'd hated sight unseen. The man he'd blamed for stealing his daughter, gone. And Sarah was alone, struggling to survive on a failing homestead with a young son to raise. The boy, how old is he? James? He's about 4 now, I reckon. Good kid, quiet, but he's been through a lot. 4 years old. Clayton tried to picture it. A child of 4, old enough to remember his father, young enough to be devastated by the loss. And Sarah, widowed and alone, fighting to keep a roof over their heads. Thank you, Clayton managed. For telling me. The man nodded. Name's Ed Pritchard. If you need anything while you're here, my place is just down that way. The one with the red door. Clayton thanked him again and continued walking, the dog now pulling ahead with barely contained eagerness. 2 miles. He was 2 miles from seeing his daughter for the first time in 20 years. The walk felt both too long and too short. With each step, Clayton's anxiety grew. What would he say to her? How could he possibly explain 20 years of silence? And what right did he have to show up now, when she was at her lowest, as if his presence could somehow make things better? But he kept walking. He'd come too far to turn back now. The Holloway homestead appeared around a bend in the creek. It was a simple structure. A cabin with a single room visible from the outside, a small barn that leaned precariously to one side, and a chicken coop that had seen better days. A vegetable garden struggled in the rocky soil, the plants wilted from lack of rain or neglect. A wagon with a broken wheel sat abandoned near the barn. The dog barked once sharp and joyful and broke into a run. Clayton watched it race toward the cabin, his heart hammering in his chest. The door opened and a woman stepped out. Sarah. Even at a distance, even after 20 years, Clayton knew her instantly. She'd grown into Margaret's image, the same height, the same way of standing with her shoulders squared. But her face was thinner than it should have been, aged by hardship. Her dress was patched and faded, her hands work-roughened. She saw the dog and her face lit up with relief and joy. She dropped to her knees as the animal reached her, throwing her arms around it. "Buddy, oh buddy, you came back. I thought you were gone for good." Then she looked up and saw Clayton. The joy drained from her face, replaced by something Clayton couldn't read. Shock, perhaps, or disbelief. She stood slowly, one hand still resting on the dog's head, and stared at him across the distance. For a long moment neither of them moved. The afternoon seemed to hold its breath. Then Sarah spoke, her voice carrying across the yard. "Papa!" The word hit Clayton like a physical blow. He'd thought he was prepared for this moment, but he wasn't, not even close. His legs felt weak, his chest tight. All the words he'd practiced in his head disappeared. "Sarah," he managed. A small boy appeared in the doorway behind her, no higher than Sarah's hip. He had dark hair like his mother, and curious eyes that studied Clayton with open interest. This was James, his grandson. Sarah turned and said something to the boy, too quiet for Clayton to hear. The child nodded and went back inside. When Sarah faced Clayton again, her expression had hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was the voice of someone who'd learned to guard her heart. Clayton took a few steps closer, then stopped, unsure of how near he was allowed to come. "The dog brought me a photograph of you and James. My name was on the back." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What photograph?" "I didn't send—" She stopped, her eyes widening slightly. Then she looked down at the dog, Buddy, who sat at her feet, tail wagging. Understanding crossed her face. "Tom," she whispered. "He must have sent Buddy with it." "Before he—" Her voice broke. Clayton felt his own throat tighten. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. Ed Pritchard told me what happened. I'm so sorry." "It's been 3 months," Sarah said, and now there was steel in her voice. 3 months since Tom died. 3 months of trying to keep this place running, trying to feed my son, trying to figure out how we're going to survive the winter. And now you show up? I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. You haven't known anything about my life for 20 years. The words came out sharp, bitter. 20 years, Papa, not a letter. Not a word. Not even when Mama died and I... She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Clayton's heart broke. I know I failed you. I failed your mother too. I can't take back those years, Sarah. I can't undo the damage I've done. But I'm here now, and I need to help. If you'll let me. Sarah shook her head slowly. Tears tracked down her cheeks, though her jaw remained set. I don't need your help. I've managed this long without you. I can manage longer. Sarah, please. No. She pointed toward the road. Go back to wherever you came from. Go back to your life. We don't need you here. But even as she said the words, Clayton could see the exhaustion in her face, the desperation she was trying to hide. The broken wagon wheel, the struggling garden, the leaning barn, it all told the story of someone barely holding on. I'm not leaving, Clayton said quietly. I made that mistake once. I'm not making it again. Sarah's expression wavered, and for a moment he saw the little girl she'd been, the one who'd asked him endless questions in the workshop, who'd looked up at him like he'd hung the stars. Then her face hardened again. Do what you want, she said finally. But don't expect me to forgive you. And don't expect to be part of our lives. She turned and went inside, closing the door firmly behind her. The dog looked from the closed door to Clayton, whined softly, then curled up on the porch as if to say, well, this is home. Now what? Clayton stood in the yard, his legs trembling, his heart breaking all over again. But he didn't leave. He'd meant what he said. He wasn't leaving. Not this time. Clayton spent that first night in the barn. It wasn't much. The roof leaked in places and the wind found every crack in the walls. But it was shelter. He made himself a bed in the hay, using his coat as a blanket, and tried to sleep despite the cold and the turmoil in his mind. Sarah's words echoed through him. 20 years, Papa, not a letter, not a word. Each repetition was a knife to the chest. He'd earned her anger. He'd earned her rejection. The only question now was whether he could earn anything else. He woke before dawn, his body stiff and aching. His knee had swollen worse during the night, and it took him several minutes to work up the courage to stand. When he finally limped out of the barn, the valley was still dark, the stars bright overhead. The cabin showed no signs of life yet. Clayton walked quietly to the broken wagon, studying it in the dim light. The wheel had cracked through the hub, a clean break that could be repaired if a man had the right tools and would. He didn't have either, but he could assess what was needed. As the sun rose, Clayton explored the homestead more thoroughly. The chicken coop needed reinforcement. Several boards had come loose, and the wire mesh was torn. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. The garden fence sagged in places where posts had rotted through. Everywhere he looked, he saw work that needed doing, repairs that had been put off too long. This was what Sarah had been facing alone. A homestead falling apart around her while she tried to care for a child and keep food on the table. Clayton felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as an opportunity. He might not be able to fix the past, but he could fix a fence. He could repair a door. He could be useful. He was examining the barn door when he heard small footsteps behind him. Clayton turned to find James standing a few yards away, watching him with solemn eyes. The boy wore oversized trousers held up with suspenders and a shirt that had been patched at the elbows. His feet were bare despite the morning chill. "Hello?" Clayton said softly, not wanting to spook him. James didn't respond, just continued to stare. "I'm Clayton. What's your name?" "James." The boy's voice was quiet, uncertain. "Mama says you're my grandpa." "That's right." "Your mother is my daughter." James considered this. Papa died. The simple statement, delivered with a child's directness, hit Clayton hard. "I know, I'm very sorry about that. He got sick. The doctor came, but he couldn't make Papa better." James scuffed one bare foot in the dirt. "Mama cries at night. She thinks I don't hear, but I do." Clayton's chest tightened. "That's because she misses him. When someone we love goes away, it hurts. Are you going to go away too?" The question was asked without accusation, just genuine curiosity. But it pierced Clayton to his core. "No," he said firmly. "I'm going to stay right here." James seemed to accept this. He walked closer, studying the barn door. "It's broke." "It is. The hinges are loose and the wood's warped. But I think I can fix it." "Really?" Really, would you like to help me? For the first time, something like interest flickered in the boy's eyes. I can help. Sure you can. First, we need to figure out what tools we have. Do you know if your father had any tools? James nodded and ran to the cabin. He returned a moment later carrying a wooden box, which he set down carefully. Inside were basic tools, a hammer, some nails, a saw that needed sharpening, and a few other implements. It wasn't much, but it was something. Clayton knelt down beside the box, ignoring the protest from his knee. This is good, real good. Now the first thing we need to do is take the door off its hinges so we can work on it properly. Can you hold this hammer while I do that? James took the hammer with both hands, his face serious with the responsibility. Clayton worked the first hinge pin free, then the second. And together they lifted the door free and laid it on the ground. Now, Clayton said, we need to see which parts are too warped to save and which parts we can work with. Your father was a carpenter, wasn't he? James shook his head. He was a farmer, but he could fix things. That's a good skill to have. My father taught me how to fix things too, and I taught your mother when she was about your age. Mama knows how to fix things? She used to. She was quite good at it, actually. Used to follow me around my workshop asking questions and wanting to help with everything. James looked back toward the cabin, as if trying to picture his mother as a child. It seemed to be a foreign concept to him. They worked through the morning, Clayton showing James how to assess the problem, how to measure what needed replacing, how to use tools safely. The boy was bright and eager, soaking up every word like dry earth absorbing rain. It reminded Clayton so powerfully of Sarah at that age that he had to stop several times to collect himself. Around midday, the cabin door opened and Sarah emerged. She stopped when she saw them working together, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Clayton thought she might object, might pull James away, but she just watched, one hand resting on the doorframe. James, she called finally. Come inside and eat something. James looked at Clayton. Will you be here when I come back? I will. The boy ran to his mother, chattering excitedly about hinges and measurements. Sarah listened, her eyes finding Clayton's across the yard. He couldn't read her expression. There was too much happening behind it, too many conflicting emotions. But she didn't tell him to leave, and that felt like progress. After James went inside, Clayton continued working. He'd found some boards in the barn that were still sound, and he used them to reinforce the door frame. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. He was fitting the door back onto its hinges when Sarah came out again, carrying a plate. She approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. You should eat, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Clayton looked at the plate. Bread, some cheese, and what looked like cold beans. Simple food, but more than he'd expected. Thank you. She set the plate on a nearby stump. James seems taken with you. He's a good boy. You've done well with him. Sarah's jaw tightened. I've done what I had to do alone, I know. And I'm sorrier than I can say that you had to. Clayton set down his tools and faced her fully. I know I don't have any right to ask for forgiveness. I know I can't make up for 20 years. But I'm going to do everything I can to help you now, whether you want me to or not. Why? Sarah's voice cracked. Why now? Why not 10 years ago or 5 years ago or when Mama was dying and begging you to write to me? Clayton felt tears sting his eyes. Because I was a fool, a stubborn, prideful fool who thought being right was more important than being a father. And by the time I realized how wrong I was, I'd convinced myself it was too late, that you'd built a life without me and wouldn't want me in it. So what changed? That dog showed up in Hollowbrook with your photograph, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, I still had something to offer. Even if it's just fixing a barn door or helping with the chores. Even if you never forgive me, at least I can be useful. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Tears tracked down her cheeks, though her expression remained hard. Tom sent that dog, she said finally. A week before he died, he told me he'd done something. He wouldn't say what. Just said that if anything happened to him, help would come. I thought he was delirious from the fever, but he'd sent Buddy all the way to Hollowbrook with that picture. He must have loved you very much. He did. Sarah's voice broke. He loved me and James more than anything. And I couldn't save him. I watched him slip away, and there was nothing I could do. Clayton took a step toward her, stopping when she held up a hand. I'm so sorry, Sarah, for all of it. For not being there when your mother died. For not being there when you got married. For missing James's birth and his first years. For not being the father you deserved. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You weren't, she said quietly. You weren't the father I deserved. But you're here now. And despite everything, despite how much I want to hate you, I don't. I'm just tired. So tired of carrying everything alone. Then let me help, please. Let me earn even a fraction of what I threw away. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, just barely. The garden needs work. And the chicken coop. And about 100 other things. I'll do them all. And don't think this means I forgive you. I'm not sure I can, not yet. Maybe not ever. I understand. Sarah turned to go back inside, then stopped. The barn door looks good, sturdy. It was the smallest of acknowledgments, but to Clayton it felt like salvation. Thank you. She went inside, leaving him alone in the yard with his plate of food and the first fragile thread of hope he'd felt in 20 years. Clayton spent the next 3 days working from dawn until dusk. He reinforced the chicken coop, patched the roof where it leaked, and started clearing the rocks from the garden so the soil might drain better. His knees screamed with every movement, but he pushed through the pain. This was penance, and he would pay it gladly. James became his constant shadow, asking questions and handing him tools with solemn concentration. The boy rarely smiled, but Clayton could see him relaxing bit by bit, the wariness fading from his eyes. It was a small victory, but Clayton treasured it. Sarah maintained her distance, though she no longer told him to leave. She brought meals to wherever he was working, simple fare but nourishing. Sometimes she watched him from the porch, her expression troubled. Clayton never pushed, never asked for more than she was willing to give. Patience was all he had to offer, besides his labor. On the 4th morning, Clayton was working on the broken wagon wheel when a rider approached. The man was well dressed by valley standards, clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a hat that looked new. He sat straight in his saddle with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. He dismounted near where Clayton worked and smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. Morning. You must be new around here. Just visiting, Clayton said, not looking up from his work. Visiting the Holloway place? The man's tone suggested he found this interesting. New family? Clayton set down his tools and stood, meeting the man's gaze. I am, and you are? Gerald Sutton. I own most of the land in this valley, the Henderson place, the Morrison place, and several others. I've been hoping to add the Holloway property to my holdings. Something cold settled in Clayton's stomach. Is that right? It is. Mrs. Holloway and I have been in discussions about it for some time now. Sutton's smile widened. Given her circumstances, I've made her a very generous offer. What circumstances would those be? Sutton's expression turned sympathetic, but it felt practiced, false. Well, her husband's passing, of course. And the fact that this place is barely viable. Between the poor soil, the failing infrastructure, and the debt Mr. Holloway accumulated before his death, I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before the bank forecloses. Clayton felt his hands curl into fists. The bank? Tom Holloway borrowed heavily to try to make this place work. Bought seed, equipment, supplies, all on credit. When he died, those debts became his widow's responsibility. Unless she can pay them back, Sutton spread his hands, as if to say the outcome was obvious. How much does she owe? That's between Mrs. Holloway and her creditors. But I've offered to assume her debts and pay her a fair price for the land besides. It would allow her and the boy to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere more forgiving? And you just happened to ride out here today to remind her of this? Sutton's smile cooled. I happened to ride out here because I heard she had company. I wanted to make sure whoever was visiting understood the situation. It wouldn't be fair to let her get her hopes up about keeping this place when that's simply not possible. The cabin door opened and Sarah emerged, her face tight when she saw Sutton. Mr. Sutton, I wasn't expecting you. Mrs. Holloway. Sutton tipped his hat. I was just explaining to your visitor here about our ongoing discussions. We're not having discussions, Sarah said. her voice hard. "You've made an offer. I've refused it. That's not a discussion. With respect, ma'am, you may not have much choice. The bank gave me until the end of October. That's 3 weeks away. I still have time." Sutton's expression grew pitying. "Time to do what? You can't work this land alone. You can't meet those payments. Be reasonable, Mrs. Holloway. Take my offer while it still stands. After the foreclosure, you'll get nothing." I said no. Clayton stepped forward, positioning himself between Sutton and Sarah. "I believe the lady has made herself clear." Sutton looked at him with new interest. "And who are you exactly?" "Her father." Something flickered in Sutton's eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or irritation. "I see. Well, Mr. Briggs, I'm sure you want what's best for your daughter and grandson. What's best is accepting reality. This homestead is finished. The sooner she accepts that and moves on, the better off she'll be. The homestead's not finished until we say it's finished." Sutton's smile vanished. "You think you can save this place? Look around you, Mr. Briggs. It's falling apart. The land is poor, the debts are mounting, and winter's coming. One old man and a widow can't turn this around in 3 weeks. Maybe not. But we can try." For a long moment, Sutton stared at him. Then he shook his head and turned to his horse. "Suit yourself. But when the bank takes this place, don't say I didn't warn you." He mounted and looked down at Sarah. "My offer stands for another week, Mrs. Holloway. After that, you're on your own." He rode away, kicking up dust. Clayton watched until he disappeared, then turned to Sarah. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembling. "How much do you owe?" he asked gently. Sarah's jaw worked, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, $280. Tom borrowed it to buy seed and fertilizer last spring, trying to get the crops to take. But the drought hit and her voice broke. Everything failed. We couldn't pay it back. $280. It might as well have been $2,000. Clayton had $3 and change in his pocket. Even if he sold everything he owned, every tool and possession, he couldn't come close to that amount. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because it's not your problem. This is my life, my mess. I've been trying to figure it out on my own, because that's what I've always done. Because 20 years ago, you made it very clear that I was on my own, and I learned how to be." Clayton's heart broke all over again. "Sarah, don't." She held up a hand, tears streaming down her face. "Just don't. I can't bear your pity right now." She turned and went back inside, the door closing firmly behind her. Clayton stood in the yard, the weight of it all crushing down on him. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks to come up with money they didn't have, to save a homestead that was barely hanging on, to fix what decades of neglect and hardship had broken. He walked slowly to the barn and sat down on an old stump, his head in his hands. Behind him he heard small footsteps. James appeared, climbing up to sit beside him. "Is Mama going to be okay?" the boy asked. Clayton wanted to lie, to offer easy comfort. But James deserved better than that. "I don't know, son. Things are difficult right now. Are we going to lose our home?" "Not if I can help it." James leaned against him, a small, warm weight. "I'm glad you're here, Grandpa." The word Grandpa hit Clayton like a benediction. He put his arm around the boy and held him close, this grandchild he'd never thought to meet, and made a silent vow. He would find a way. Somehow, some way, he would save this place. He'd failed Sarah once. He would not fail her again. That evening, after James had gone to bed, Clayton sat outside the cabin, thinking. $280 was a fortune to people like them. But it wasn't impossible. There had to be a way to earn it or borrow it, or... His thoughts were interrupted by the cabin door opening. Sarah stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. She sat down on the porch steps, not quite beside him, but close enough. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Sarah said, "Tom was trying to save this place for James. He wanted to give him something solid, something that would last. He worked himself to death trying to make it happen. I'm sorry I wasn't here to help. You couldn't have changed anything. The land is what it is. The debts are what they are." She paused. "Sutton's been circling like a vulture since Tom died. He owns half the valley now, bought up every homestead that failed. He wants to consolidate it all, turn it into one big cattle operation. What happens to the families? Most move on, find work in the cities, or try their luck elsewhere. A few stay on as hired hands, but Sutton doesn't pay much. Clayton was quiet, thinking. Then he said, "We're not letting him have this place. How are we going to stop him? We can't pay the debt. I don't know yet. But we'll figure something out." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he'd been afraid he'd never see again. A flicker of hope, tentative and fragile, but real. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "After everything, why do you care so much about saving this place?" "Because it's your home. It's James's home. And because," Clayton's voice caught, "because I should have been here all along. I should have been here when you needed me, when Tom was alive and working himself to the bone. I should have been here when he died, helping you grieve and figure out what comes next. I can't change any of that. But I'm here now, and I'll be damned if I let some land grabber take away the only thing you have left." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and took his hand just for a moment. Just long enough for Clayton to feel the connection between them, still there beneath all the hurt and years. Then she stood and went back inside, leaving Clayton alone with the stars and the impossible task ahead of him. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt something like purpose burning in his chest. He would save this homestead, or he would die trying. Clayton woke before dawn, with his mind already working. $280. 3 weeks. There had to be a way. He dressed quickly and walked into the valley as the sun rose, heading for Ed Pritchard's place. The older man was in his barn milking a cow when Clayton found him. "Morning," Ed said, looking up. "Heard you decided to stick around?" "I did. Ed, I need to ask you something." "What do you know about Gerald Sutton?" Ed's expression soured. "Enough to know he's not someone you want to cross. He's bought up half the valley in the last 5 years, always offering just enough to tempt folks who are struggling. Once he owns the land, he runs cattle on it and hires a few hands to do the work. Is he honest in his dealings?" "Legal, anyway. Can't say it's honest when he waits until families are desperate before making his move, but he doesn't break any laws doing it." Clayton nodded slowly. "Sarah owes the bank $280. 3 weeks to pay or they foreclose." Ed let out a low whistle. "That's a heavy burden. Is there any way to make that kind of money out here? Any crops that could be harvested and sold quickly? Any work that pays well?" Ed shook his head. "Not this time of year, not in 3 weeks. Even if you had crops ready to harvest, which you don't, you'd have to get them to market, and that takes time. As for work, most folks around here are just scraping by themselves." Clayton felt his hope deflating, but he pressed on. "What about loans? Is there anyone who might lend the money? Bank's the only source of credit for most folks, and they're the ones calling in the debt. Sutton might lend it, but he'd want the land as collateral, which means you'd be right back where you started." Clayton thanked him and moved on, visiting every homestead in the valley over the next 2 days. The story was the same everywhere, sympathy but no solutions. The valley was full of people barely making ends meet, with nothing extra to spare. On the 3rd day, Clayton walked into Blackwater, the nearest town with a bank and proper businesses. His knee protested every step of the 10-mile journey, but he pushed through. He needed to see if there were any options he'd missed. The bank manager was a thin man with spectacles and a ledger-keeper's precise manner. He listened to Clayton's inquiry with polite disinterest. "Mr. Holloway's debts are substantial," the manager said. "And given that Mrs. Holloway has no collateral beyond the homestead itself, which is already pledged against the loan, I'm afraid we cannot extend any additional credit. What if someone else guaranteed the loan? What if I signed on as a guarantor?" The manager looked at Clayton over his spectacles. "And what collateral would you offer, Mr. Briggs?" Clayton thought of his tools, his few possessions. "Nothing that would satisfy a banker. I have skills. I can do carpentry work, wagon repair. We deal in assets, not promises." "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." Clayton left the bank feeling defeated but not broken. There had to be another way. He just had to find it. He was walking past the general store when something in the window caught his eye. A sign advertised a harvest fair in 2 weeks, with prizes for livestock, produce, crafts, and other competitions. First prize in several categories was $50. $50. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. If they could win multiple categories, Clayton went inside and spoke to the shopkeeper, learning the details. The fair would be held in Blackwater, drawing people from all the surrounding valleys. There were competitions for best horse, best crafted item, best preserves, best needlework, even best trained dog. Best trained dog. Clayton thought of Buddy, the animal that had traveled 30 miles carrying a message, that had found him in a town it had never been to before. That dog was smart, maybe smart enough to win a competition. He walked back to the homestead faster than he'd come, ideas forming. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a start. If they could win even 2 or 3 categories, that would be over $100. Combined with what little money they had, and if they could find creative ways to raise the rest, Sarah was in the garden when he returned, pulling weeds with fierce determination. James sat nearby, playing with Buddy. The dog had filled out in the past week, its coat shinier, its energy returning. "Sarah," Clayton called, "I need to talk to you." She straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Did you find something?" "Maybe. There's a harvest fair in 2 weeks. Prize money for various competitions. If we could enter and win a few categories, how much prize money?" $50 per category for first place. Sarah's face fell. "That's not nearly enough. Not by itself. But if we win 3 or 4 categories, that's $200. We'd still need to find the rest, but it narrows the gap." "What categories?" Clayton ticked them off on his fingers. "Best trained dog. I think Buddy could win that. Best crafted item. If I had materials, I could make something. Best preserves or needlework. Can you do either of those?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Mama taught me both. I haven't made preserves in years, but I remember how. And I can do needlework, though it takes time. We have a week and a half before the fair. If we work hard, it's still not enough," Sarah said, but her tone had shifted. There was something in her voice now, not quite hope, but a willingness to try. "I know. But it's better than nothing, and maybe while we're working on this, we'll think of other ways to raise the rest." Sarah looked at James, who was throwing a stick for Buddy to fetch. The dog retrieved it perfectly every time, dropping it at the boy's feet. "Tom trained Buddy," she said softly. "He spent hours working with that dog. Said a good dog was worth its weight in gold. Then let's prove him right." Over the next week, the homestead transformed into a hive of focused activity. Clayton worked with Buddy for hours each day, teaching the dog more complex commands, fetch specific items, stay at increasing distances, navigate simple obstacle courses. The dog was brilliant, learning quickly and performing with enthusiasm. In the evenings, Clayton worked on his crafted item. He'd decided to make a small jewelry box, using what good wood he could salvage from around the property. It would have a hidden drawer with a spring mechanism, a trick his father had taught him decades ago. It was intricate work that made his hands ache, but he persevered. Sarah threw herself into making preserves and working on a piece of needlework, a sampler with an intricate border and a verse in the center. She worked by lamplight late into the night, her fingers moving with practiced precision. James helped where he could, fetching tools or ingredients, encouraging Buddy during training sessions. The boy had come alive over the past week, smiling more often, asking constant questions. He called Clayton Grandpa now without hesitation, and the word never failed to fill Clayton with warmth. One evening, as Clayton was putting the finishing touches on the jewelry box, Sarah sat down beside him. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "I'd forgotten how skilled you are. Your mother always said I had patience with wood that I didn't have with people." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I remember watching you work when I was little. You'd let me help even though I probably just got in the way. You never got in the way. You were always eager to learn, always trying to do things right. I was proud of that. Were you?" Sarah's voice was soft. I always thought I disappointed you, that I wasn't what you wanted me to be." Clayton set down his tools and faced her fully. "You never disappointed me, Sarah. Never. I was the disappointment. I was so focused on what I thought was right, on protecting you from mistakes, that I forgot to just love you, to trust that you could make your own decisions and find your own way." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "I loved Tom. He wasn't perfect, but he loved me and he loved James. We were happy even when things were hard. And I kept wishing you could have seen that you could have known him. I wish that too. More than I can say." Sarah reached out and took his hand. "I'm glad you're here, Papa. I didn't think I would be, but I am." It was the first time she'd called him Papa without anger or bitterness in her voice. Clayton squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The next day, Doc Henley arrived from Hollowbrook. Clayton had written him a letter the previous week, explaining the situation. "The doctor stepped down from his wagon carrying a small bag. Came as soon as I could," Doc said. "Got your letter. Thought I might be able to help. Doc, what are you doing here?" "Brought you something." He handed Clayton the bag. Inside were tools. His tools, the ones from his workshop in Hollowbrook. "Figured you might need these more than they need to sit gathering dust." Clayton felt his eyes burn. "Doc also brought this." Doc pulled out a small leather pouch. "It's $35. It's not much, but it's what I could spare. I can't take your money." "You can and you will. Margaret was a good friend to my late wife. She'd want me to help if I could. Consider it a loan if you must, but I'm giving it freely." Sarah had come out of the cabin, and she looked between the two men with wonder. "Thank you," she said to Doc. "Thank you so much." "There's more," Doc said. "I spoke to Widow Hartman before I left. She's putting together a collection from folks in Hollowbrook, people who remember you, Clayton. People who want to help. I'll bring whatever they raise when I come back through next week." Clayton couldn't speak. He'd spent so long thinking he was alone that he'd burned every bridge. But here was proof that kindness still existed, that community meant something. "Now," Doc said, "show me this homestead that needs saving, and introduce me to my grandson." James came running at the sound of a new voice, and Doc swept him up with a laugh. Clayton watched them together, his old friend and his grandson, and felt something like joy kindle in his chest. They still needed over $100, even with Doc's contribution. The fair prizes might cover it if they won. But even if they fell short, Clayton realized, they weren't facing this alone anymore. That night, as stars emerged overhead, Clayton sat on the porch with Sarah. In the distance, they could hear James laughing at something Doc had said. "We can do this," Clayton said. "Even if we don't get all the money, we'll find a way." Sarah nodded. Together, Clayton agreed, and for the first time in 20 years, he believed it. The morning of the harvest fair dawned clear and cool. Clayton woke with his stomach in knots, something he hadn't felt since he was a young man facing uncertain prospects. Today would determine whether they could save the homestead, or whether all their work had been for nothing. They loaded their entries into Ed Pritchard's borrowed wagon, the jewelry box wrapped in cloth, Sarah's preserves in their sealed jars, her needlework sampler carefully protected between boards. Buddy sat alert beside James, sensing something important was happening. The ride to Blackwater took 2 hours. Clayton used the time to run through Buddy's commands in his mind, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. Sarah sat quiet beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. "Whatever happens," Clayton said, "we tried. That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Sarah replied. "But I still want to win," he smiled. "So do I." Blackwater was transformed for the fair. Banners hung across Main Street, and booths lined both sides of the road. Farmers displayed their best produce, craftspeople showed their wares, and livestock pens held everything from prize pigs to champion horses. The air smelled of roasted corn and fresh bread, and children ran between the stalls with sticky hands and bright eyes. They found the registration booth and entered their competitions. The crafts judging would take place at noon, the needlework and preserves at 1, and the dog competition at 2. They had 4 hours to wait. Clayton walked through the fair with James, pointing out different animals and explaining how things were made. The boy absorbed it all with his usual serious attention, occasionally asking questions that showed he'd been thinking deeply about what he'd seen. Grandpa, James said, as they watched a blacksmith demonstrate his trade. "What happens if we don't win?" Clayton knelt down to the boy's level, ignoring the protest from his knee. "Then we figure out another way. But James, sometimes trying is more important than winning. Sometimes showing up and doing your best, that's the real victory. But we need the money, we do. But what we need more is each other. And we have that already." James hugged him then, fierce and sudden. Clayton held him close, breathing in the smell of boy and soap and wondering how he'd lived so long without this, without family, without purpose, without love. At noon, they gathered with the other entrants for the crafts judging. Clayton's jewelry box sat on a table alongside carved figures, woven baskets and tooled leather goods. All of it was beautiful, the work of skilled hands. The judges were 3 men from Blackwater, a furniture maker, a saddle maker, and the owner of the general store. They examined each piece carefully, opening drawers, testing joints, studying the craftsmanship with critical eyes. When they reached Clayton's box, they spent a long time with it. One judge found the hidden drawer immediately, which made Clayton's heart sink. The surprise was half the point. But then the man smiled and showed it to the others, and they nodded with approval. The judges conferred in low voices. Then the furniture maker stepped forward. "The first prize goes to entry number 7, the jewelry box with the spring mechanism. It's exceptional work, both functional and beautiful." Clayton felt Sarah grab his arm, her fingers tight. He'd won $50, just like that. At 1 o'clock, they moved to the domestic arts tent for the preserves and needlework judging. Sarah's entries were set among dozens of others, and Clayton could see the quality of the competition. Women who'd been making preserves and doing needlework their entire lives, each one hoping for the same prize they needed. The preserves judging came first. The judges tasted each entry on small crackers, making notes. Sarah's cherry preserves gleamed like rubies in their jar, and when the judges tasted them, one woman closed her eyes with pleasure. But when the results were announced, Sarah took second place. $30 instead of 50. Clayton saw her face fall and put his hand on her shoulder. "That's still good," he whispered. "That's still money we didn't have before." The needlework judging took longer. The judges examined each piece with magnifying glasses, checking the evenness of stitches and the intricacy of design. Sarah's sampler was beautiful, a border of intertwined flowers surrounding a verse she'd written herself about home and family. When the judges announced the results, Sarah won first place. Another $50. They stood together outside the tent, counting in their heads $130 in prizes. With Doc's $35 and the small amount Clayton had saved, they had just over $170. They still needed more than 100. Everything now depended on Buddy. At 2 o'clock, they gathered at the dog competition ring. There were maybe a dozen entries, cattle dogs, hunting dogs, even a small terrier that could walk on its hind legs. Buddy sat calmly beside Clayton, waiting for his command. The competition proceeded in stages. Basic commands: first, sit, stay, come. Buddy performed perfectly, but so did most of the other dogs. Then more complex commands: fetch specific items from a group, navigate obstacles, respond to hand signals from a distance. One by one, dogs were eliminated. The cattle dog couldn't fetch specific items reliably. The hunting dog wouldn't stay when there were distractions. The terrier was too small to navigate the obstacles quickly. By the final round, only 3 dogs remained: Buddy, a large shepherd mix, and a sleek pointer. The final test would be the most difficult. The dog had to retrieve 3 specific items in order from a pile of objects, bring them back one at a time, and place them in the judge's hand without prompting. The shepherd went first. It retrieved 2 items correctly, but got confused on the third, bringing back the wrong object. The pointer went next. It retrieved all 3 items, but dropped 1 before reaching the judge. Finally, it was Buddy's turn. Clayton gave the command and held his breath. Buddy trotted to the pile of objects: rope, ball, stick, cloth, and metal ring. He sniffed them briefly, then picked up the rope and brought it back, placing it in the judge's outstretched hand. Back to the pile. He selected the stick, brought it back. Then finally the ball, completing the sequence perfectly. The crowd applauded. James jumped up and down, shouting encouragement. Sarah gripped Clayton's hand so tight it hurt. The judges conferred. Clayton watched their faces, trying to read the verdict. Then they stepped forward and the head judge announced, "First prize goes to Buddy, owned by the Holloway family." Clayton felt his knees go weak. They'd done it. $50 more. That brought them to just over $220. They were still $60 short. They stood in the afternoon shadows, holding their prize ribbons and checks, and faced the arithmetic of their failure. $220 when they needed $280. $60 short, close enough to taste victory, but not close enough to claim it. "We tried," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "That's what you said mattered." Clayton wanted to rage against the unfairness of it, but what good would that do? They'd done their best. Sometimes your best wasn't enough. "Papa! Mama!" They turned to see Doc Henley making his way through the crowd, waving a leather pouch above his head. He reached them breathless, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "The collection," he said, pressing the pouch into Clayton's hands. "From Hollowbrook. I didn't want to get your hopes up until I had it all counted." Clayton opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside were bills and coins, carefully bundled. He counted quickly, his heart hammering. $40. Maybe 45, still not enough. Doc saw his expression. "How much more do you need?" "About $20. Doc's face fell. "I'm sorry. I tried. I went to everyone I could think of." "You've done more than enough," Clayton said. "More than we had any right to ask." They started walking back toward the wagon. The excitement of the victories drained away. James walked between Clayton and Sarah, holding both their hands, trying to be brave, though Clayton could see tears gathering in his eyes. They were loading the wagon when a voice called out behind them, "Mr. Briggs." "Is that you?" Clayton turned to find a woman in her 60s, well-dressed with kind eyes. She looked familiar, though he couldn't place her. "I'm sorry," he said. "Do I know you?" "Martha Peterson. You fixed my wagon last month in Hollowbrook. Though I suppose I've aged since you saw me last." Clayton remembered then, the widow with the broken axle, the one who'd paid him with $1.50 in preserves. "Mrs. Peterson, what are you doing here?" "Visiting my sister." But that's not important. She'd been listening, he realized. She'd heard their conversation with Doc. "I heard you're trying to save a homestead, that you're short on funds." "We are, and I heard you won the crafts competition today." She smiled. "That doesn't surprise me. Your work on my wagon was exceptional. Best repair I've ever seen." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small envelope. "This is $25. It's what my late husband left me for emergencies. I can't think of a better emergency than saving a family's home." Clayton stared at the envelope. "Mrs. Peterson, I can't." "You can and you will. You did good work for me when you were struggling yourself. You quoted me fairly when you could have asked for more. This is me returning the favor." Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Mrs. Peterson patted her cheek gently. "Family is everything, dear. Don't ever forget that." She walked away before they could say anything more. Clayton looked at the envelope in his hands, then at Doc, then at Sarah. They had it. They actually had it, $285. Enough to pay the debt with a few dollars to spare. The ride back to Red Creek Valley passed in a blur of emotion. James fell asleep against Clayton's shoulder, exhausted by the day. Sarah sat quietly, the checks and cash secured in her pocket, occasionally touching them as if to confirm they were real. "We did it," she said finally, her voice full of wonder. "We actually did it." "We did," Clayton agreed. Together. The next morning they rode to the bank in Blackwater. The manager who'd turned Clayton away before now looked at them with new interest as Sarah counted out the money on his desk. "The full amount," she said. $280 as agreed. The manager counted it carefully, made notations in his ledger, and stamped a document. "The debt is satisfied. The lien on your property is released." He handed her the document. "Congratulations, Mrs. Holloway." They walked out of the bank into bright sunshine. Sarah held the document like it was made of gold, which in a way it was, proof that the homestead was theirs, free and clear. "What do we do now?" she asked. Clayton thought about it. The homestead still needed work. The fields still needed planting. Winter was coming and there was preparation to do. But for the first time, they had time. They had security. They had a future. Now, he said, we go home and get to work. But he knew it was more than that. They'd go home and build something together. They'd repair more than just buildings. They'd repair the years of silence and hurt. They'd create new memories to replace the painful ones. That evening, as they pulled up to the homestead, Gerald Sutton was waiting in the yard. He sat on his horse with his usual confident posture, but something about his expression had changed. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, tipping his hat, "I heard you paid off your debt." "I did. That's quite an accomplishment." "Not many could have done it. I didn't do it alone." Sutton's gaze moved to Clayton, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. "I can see that. Well, I suppose my offer is no longer relevant." "It never was," Sarah said firmly. Sutton nodded, acknowledging the truth of that. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're staying. The valley needs people who fight for what's theirs." He turned his horse. "Good evening to you both." They watched him ride away, then looked at each other and started laughing, not from joy so much as relief. The release of weeks of tension and fear. James ran to greet them, Buddy at his heels. "Did we save it? Did we save our home?" Clayton swept the boy up in his arms. "We did, son. We saved it, forever." "Forever," Sarah said, joining them. She put her arms around both Clayton and James, and they stood there together in the fading light, 3 generations, bound by blood and love and the hard work of forgiveness. Clayton closed his eyes and felt Margaret's presence, as if she were standing with them, smiling. He'd kept his promise to her, finally. He'd made things right with their daughter, and he'd found in the process that redemption was possible even after decades of mistakes. The homestead wasn't much, rough land with a leaning barn and a struggling garden, but it was home. And that was everything. Winter came to Red Creek Valley with a gentleness that surprised everyone. The snows were light, the cold manageable, and the little homestead weathered it all with strength that hadn't been there before. Clayton spent those months making repairs he'd put off during the rush to save the place. He rebuilt the chicken coop properly, reinforced the barn until it no longer leaned, and fixed every broken board and sagging post. His hands remembered the work they'd done in his youth, and though his knees still ached and his back grew stiff in the cold, he found joy in the labor. Sarah worked beside him when she could, learning again the skills her father had taught her as a child. They talked while they worked, carefully at first, then with growing ease. She told him about her life with Tom, the good years and the hard ones, the dreams they'd had for the homestead. Clayton listened and learned about the man his daughter had loved, and he found he couldn't resent Tom Holloway. The man had loved Sarah well, had died trying to provide for his family. What more could a father ask of his daughter's husband? James was everywhere at once, eager to help with every project. Clayton taught him the same lessons his own father had taught him: how to measure twice and cut once, how to read wood grain, how to care for tools. The boy absorbed it all with serious concentration, and Clayton saw in him the same hunger to learn that Sarah had possessed at that age. One evening in late January, as the 3 of them sat by the fire after supper, James climbed into Clayton's lap with a question. "Grandpa, are you going to stay forever?" Clayton looked at Sarah, who was mending a shirt by lamplight. She glanced up and met his eyes, and he saw the answer there before she spoke. "Your grandfather lives here now," she said. "This is his home too." James nodded, satisfied and settled against Clayton's chest. The boy's weight was warm and solid, real in a way that made Clayton's throat tight. How close he'd come to missing this, to living out his days in that narrow room in Hollowbrook, alone with his regrets, never knowing he had a grandson who needed him. "I'm staying," Clayton said, his arms around the boy. "I'm not going anywhere." In February, Doc Henley arrived with news from Hollowbrook. Widow Hartman sent her regards and a package of baked goods. Several townspeople had asked after Clayton, wondering how things had turned out. Even Ed Pritchard had sent a message, congratulating them on saving the homestead. "You're missed," Doc said over coffee. "But I think you're exactly where you need to be," Clayton agreed. For the first time in decades, he felt useful, needed, part of something larger than his own small life. Spring came slowly, then all at once. The snow melted, the creek swelled, and the prairie burst into green. Clayton and Sarah planted the garden together, choosing vegetables that would thrive in the difficult soil. They planted wheat in the north field, corn in the south, both in smaller quantities than Tom had attempted, learning from his mistakes, building slowly toward success rather than gambling everything on a single harvest. James helped plant every seed, his small hands working the soil beside theirs. Buddy supervised the operation from a sunny spot near the fence, his tail thumping contentedly. One evening, as Clayton sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and rose, Sarah joined him. She carried something wrapped in cloth, which she handed to him. "I found this in Tom's things," she said. "I thought you should have it." Clayton unwrapped the cloth to find a small wooden frame. Inside was the photograph the dog had carried to Hollowbrook, Sarah holding baby James, both of them smiling despite the weariness in Sarah's eyes. But someone had added to it. Beside that photograph was another, one of Clayton as a younger man, standing with Margaret in front of their house, both of them laughing at something beyond the frame. "Tom did this," Sarah said, "before he got sick. He said James should know both his grandfathers, even if one was gone and the other," her voice caught, "even if the other seemed lost to us. He believed you'd come back someday. That's why he trained Buddy to find you." Clayton stared at the photographs, the two halves of James's history joined together. Tom Holloway had done that, had reached across anger and estrangement to give his son the gift of family. It was an act of generosity Clayton wasn't sure he would have been capable of in Tom's position. "He was a good man," Clayton said. "I'm sorry I never knew him. He would have liked you, I think. You're both stubborn and loyal and too proud for your own good." Sarah smiled through her tears. "But you both loved me. That's what mattered to him." Clayton set the frame carefully beside him and took Sarah's hand. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Proud of the woman you've become, the mother you are, the strength you've shown. I should have told you that 20 years ago. I should have trusted you to make your own choices. You're telling me now. That's what matters." They sat together as the stars emerged, father and daughter, the silence between them no longer heavy with hurt, but comfortable with understanding. Inside, they could hear James laughing at something, Buddy barking in response. The sounds of home, the sounds of family. Later that night, Clayton lay in his small room, the addition he'd built onto the cabin during the winter months. It wasn't much, just a bed and a chair and a window that looked out over the valley. But it was his, a place where he belonged. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the starving dog limping up the road in Hollowbrook, the photograph that had changed everything, the long walk across the prairie, following an animal that somehow knew the way home. He thought about Doc and Mrs. Peterson and all the people who'd helped when help was needed most. He thought about Margaret and the promise he'd finally kept, but mostly he thought about Sarah and James, sleeping in the next room, safe and secure in a home they'd fought to keep. He thought about the spring planting and the summer harvest to come, about teaching James to work wood, about the years stretching ahead, years he'd been given as a gift he didn't deserve, but would treasure nonetheless. Sometimes the hardest roads in life lead us to the greatest blessings. Clayton had learned that truth the hard way, but he'd learned it, and that was what mattered. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of new growth and rain. Tomorrow, there would be work to do. There was always work to do. But tonight, Clayton Briggs was exactly where he needed to be. He was home, and he was, finally, at peace.